On a cold morning in town, Ethan Walker trudged along, trying to forget the pain of the past. On the other side of the courtroom, a wealthy man and a woman with no evidence against them, along with a puppy. Everyone thought the trial was over. But when the man entered without a word or action, with just a few gestures, he astonished the entire courtroom. Before we begin, please let me know where you're watching from. Subscribe for more. Winter pressed down on the town like a heavy lid, snow muting every sound, the sky a dull slate that turned noon into twilight and made even breathing feel deliberate and slow. Ethan Walker lived on the edge of that silence, in a one-room log cabin crouched beneath pines that bowed under the weight of ice. He was 42, tall and broad-shouldered, built like a man carved for endurance rather than beauty. Years in uniform had left his posture rigid, his movements economical. His hair was dark but threaded with early gray at the temples, always kept short out of habit. A jagged scar ran from the corner of his left eyebrow into his hairline, pale against weathered skin that never seemed to fully warm. His beard grew in unevenly, coarse and peppered with gray, because shaving felt like an unnecessary ritual now. Ethan's eyes were the most striking thing about him. Steel blue, sharp, always scanning, always braced for something that never came. He had been a Navy SEALK 9 handler, and the loss of his last partner on a mission overseas had hollowed him out in ways no civilian word could properly describe. He worked nights guarding a frozen storage facility outside town, a job that suited him because it required little conversation and rewarded vigilance. During the day, he slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound, dreams often dragging him back to desert heat and radio static, to a weight in his arms that was no longer breathing. He avoided people not out of arrogance, but exhaustion. He avoided dogs entirely. The sight of one any size, any color made his chest tighten, made his hands curl as if they expected a leash that was no longer there. Isolation wasn't a preference. It was a survival strategy. On a gray winter morning after finishing a long shift, Ethan drove his aging pickup into town for supplies. Snowflakes spiraled lazily in the air, thick enough to blur the edges of buildings. As he passed the courthouse, a squat brick structure with narrow windows and an American flag stiff with frost, movement caught his eye. 2 lawyers stood near the steps, voices tense, and between them was a young woman clutching a bundle wrapped in a thin blanket. Ethan slowed without fully understanding why. He told himself it was habit, situational awareness drilled too deep to erase, but something else tugged at him, something quieter and more insistent. The woman was Emily Carter, though Ethan wouldn't learn her name until later. She appeared to be in her early 30s, slim and slightly underweight, with shoulders that curved inward as if she had learned to make herself small. Her brown hair was pulled into a messy knot at the nape of her neck, strands escaping to frame a pale face, flushed red from the cold. Her eyes were a soft hazel, wide with worry, but steady, the eyes of someone used to holding her ground without raising her voice. She wore a second-hand winter coat that was a size too large, the cuffs frayed, gloves mismatched. Despite the cold, she stood still, jaw set, arms wrapped protectively around what she held. Across from her stood Mark Reynolds, her ex-husband, a man who seemed almost out of place in the muted palette of the town. He was in his late 40s, tall and trim, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence rather than calm. His hair was blonde, styled neatly even in the snow, and his face was clean-shaven, sharp at the cheekbones, with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. He wore an expensive charcoal coat and leather gloves, his breath fogging the air as he spoke in clipped, controlled sentences. Mark was successful, accustomed to being listened to, and his irritation at the delay was visible in the way his fingers tapped against his phone. To him, this was an inconvenience, not a crisis. The bundle in Emily's arm shifted, and a small head emerged. It was a German Shepherd puppy, no more than 4 months old, all oversized paws and awkward limbs, his coat a mix of deep black and tan that hinted at strong working-line genetics. His ears hadn't decided whether to stand yet, one half lifted, the other folded, giving him a perpetually uncertain expression. His eyes, dark and intelligent, darted from face to face, whites showing whenever Mark raised his voice. The puppy trembled despite the blanket, his body taut with a vigilance that felt wrong for something so young. Ethan watched from his truck, engine idling, and felt something in his chest shift. It wasn't the argument that held his attention. He'd seen worse conflicts dissolve into noise and posturing. It was the puppy's gaze. Fear, yes, but beneath it, something sharper. Awareness, the way the pup tracked movement, the way his muscles stayed coiled as if ready to spring or bolt. Ethan had spent years learning to read dogs bred for work, dogs wired for purpose, and this one carried the unmistakable imprint of that lineage. He wasn't just scared. He was assessing. Emily knelt slightly, murmuring to the puppy in a low voice, her breath fogging against his fur. She didn't command him to be quiet or still. She simply stayed close, her body angled to shield him from the wind and from Mark. The puppy leaned into her instinctively, pressing his head against her chest. Ethan noticed that, too. Trust formed under pressure, not taught, but earned. It was something he had once known intimately, something he had lost. A court clerk emerged briefly, a middle-aged woman in a thick sweater and sensible boots, her expression tired but professional. She spoke quietly to the lawyers, gestured toward the door, and retreated back inside. The dispute would continue, she indicated, but not here in the snow. Mark sighed, annoyance flashing across his face, while Emily exhaled slowly, relief and dread tangled together. As they moved toward the entrance, the puppy startled at the sudden motion and let out a small, sharp bark, immediately clamping his mouth shut, as if punished for the sound before. That reaction hit Ethan harder than he expected. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. Somewhere in his memory, another bark echoed, cut short by gunfire, and shouted commands. He swallowed, forcing the past back down where it belonged. He told himself this wasn't his concern. He wasn't part of this story. He was just passing through. But as Emily disappeared inside the courthouse, the puppy twisted in her arms to look back, eyes meeting Ethan's through the falling snow. For a moment, just a moment, Ethan felt seen. Not recognized, not understood, but acknowledged, as if the animal sensed something familiar in him. The connection snapped almost immediately, the door closing behind them, but the echo lingered. Ethan drove away, tires crunching over packed snow, telling himself he was overthinking, that fatigue played tricks on the mind. Yet all the way back to his cabin, the image stayed with him. A working-line puppy shaking in a courthouse doorway, treated like a possession rather than a living, feeling creature. He brewed coffee he didn't want, sat at his rough wooden table, and stared at the frost creeping across the window. The silence of the cabin felt heavier than usual, pressing against his ears. He thought about the concept of ownership, about how easily people claim things they didn't understand. In the teams, dogs were never just dogs. They were partners, lifelines, beings with instincts that could save or end lives depending on how they were handled. Mishandled potential didn't simply disappear. It twisted, sometimes violently. Ethan had seen that too. Outside, the wind picked up, sending snow skittering across the clearing. Ethan stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the cold until it burned. He didn't know why the scene at the courthouse had unsettled him so deeply. He only knew that something dormant inside him had stirred, something he had buried alongside grief and guilt. For the first time in years, Ethan Walker found himself thinking not about what he had lost, but about something fragile standing on the edge of being broken, and the uncomfortable realization that he might not be able to look away again. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper, disinfectant, and damp wool, a scent that clung to winter hearings in small towns where snow was tracked inside on every boot. Pale daylight filtered through high windows, diluted by heavy clouds, giving the room a flat gray tone that erased any sense of warmth. Ethan Walker sat in the last row again, shoulders squared, hands resting loosely on his thighs, still as if he were on watch. He hadn't planned to come back. He had told himself the scene from the previous morning was none of his business. And yet, when he woke from a shallow sleep, haunted by half-remembered commands and phantom paw steps, he found himself pulling on his coat and driving into town without conscious decision, drawn back to the courthouse by something he refused to name. Emily Carter sat at the plaintiff's table this time, no longer standing in the snow, but exposed under the sterile lights. Up close, her exhaustion was more apparent. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands, long-fingered, slightly reddened from cold and overwork, never stopped moving, smoothing the blanket wrapped around the puppy in her lap. She kept her spine straight despite the strain, chin lifted, as though posture were the only armor she had left. When she spoke quietly to the dog, her voice trembled just enough to betray how much effort it took to remain composed. Across the aisle, Mark Reynolds looked entirely at ease. He leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting over the opposite knee, the polished toe of his boot gleaming even in the muted light. His coat was draped neatly over the back of his chair, revealing a tailored suit beneath, charcoal gray and perfectly pressed. Mark's confidence radiated outward, not loud or aggressive, but smooth and assured, the confidence of a man used to contracts, negotiations, and outcomes bending in his favor. His expression remained neutral as his attorney spoke, but there was a faint tightening at the corners of his mouth, impatience disguised as restraint. The puppy Max lay, curled against Emily's abdomen, his head tucked beneath her arm. Up close, Ethan could see more details that confirmed his initial instinct. The dog coat was dense and healthy despite his condition, the black saddle deep and rich, the tan clean and sharply defined along his legs and muzzle. His paws were disproportionately large, a telltale sign of a working-line shepherd bred for size and stamina. Even lying still, Max's ears twitched at every sound, his eyes flicking open whenever a voice rose above a murmur. He did not relax. He monitored. That kind of vigilance wasn't learned in a week on the street. It was wired in. The judge, a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, with thinning white hair and a face carved by decades of restrained authority, listened without expression as Mark's attorney presented the case. The attorney was a compact man with dark hair combed precisely to the side and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified eyes trained to spot weakness. His voice was measured, confident, and filled with the language of documentation and ownership. He spoke of a deposit placed months earlier on a German Shepherd puppy from a certified working dog breeder, a breeder who supplied dogs to law enforcement and private security firms across several states. He referenced transport records, a delivery gone wrong during a winter storm, and the microchip implanted beneath the dog's skin that matched the breeder's files exactly. As the attorney spoke, a folder was passed forward, thick with papers. Ethan leaned slightly to the side, catching glimpses of printed forms and stamped seals. On paper alone, the case was clean. Mark Reynolds had paid for the dog. The dog had gone missing in transit. The dog had been found. End of story. That was how Mark saw it, and judging by the judge's thoughtful nod, the logic was not lost on the bench. Emily's attorney stood next, a woman named Sarah Milton, whom Ethan noticed for the first time. Sarah appeared to be in her late 30s, tall and lean, with dark auburn hair cut just above her shoulders in a practical style that suggested long hours and little patience for vanity. Her skin was fair, freckled lightly across the nose, and her eyes were sharp but tired, the eyes of someone who carried more cases than resources. She wore a navy blazer that had seen better days and sensible shoes scuffed at the heels. When she spoke, there was conviction in her voice, but also strain. This was not a case she expected to win on paper. Sarah didn't deny the existence of the microchip or the breeder's records. Instead, she described the circumstances under which Emily had found the puppy. A cardboard box left beside a dumpster behind a closed grocery store, half buried in snow during a night storm that dropped temperatures below zero. She described Emily's decision to stay with the dog for hours, using her own coat to keep him warm, her hands numb and aching as she waited for morning and a shelter to open. As Sarah spoke, Emily's jaw clenched, memories flickering across her face. She looked down at Max, fingers pressing into his fur as if grounding herself in the present. Mark's attorney objected softly, calling the story emotional but irrelevant. The dog, he argued, was not abandoned by his client. He had been lost during transport. What happened after was unfortunate, but did not change ownership. The words were precise. Bloodless. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had heard similar language used to justify worse things than neglect. The judge raised a hand, allowing the narrative to continue, but signaling his impatience with repetition. The balance of the case remained tipped toward documentation, toward the comfort of records and receipts. Ethan watched Emily's shoulders tighten. She knew it too. She was fighting gravity with bare hands. From his seat in the back, Ethan studied Max more closely. The puppy had begun to shake, not violently, but in a subtle, constant tremor that ran through his frame. His breathing was shallow, rapid. When Mark shifted in his chair, the dog flinched, muscles tensing as if bracing for impact. Ethan recognized the signs immediately. This was not simple fear. This was conditioned anticipation. Someone had taught this dog, intentionally or not, that raised voices and looming figures meant danger. Ethan's mind drifted, unbidden, to another kennel half a world away, to a dog who had learned the sound of helicopters meant work, and the sound of shouting meant urgency, not threat. That dog had trusted him completely. He had trusted that dog in return. The thought tightened Ethan's throat. He swallowed hard, grounding himself again in the present. The attorney concluded his argument by emphasizing the dog's financial value. This was not a pet store puppy, he reminded the court. This was a working line animal with significant market worth, an investment intended for professional use. Returning the dog to its rightful owner ensured proper training and placement. Anything else would be irresponsible. Emily's attorney rested her case with quieter words, focusing on welfare rather than ownership. She spoke of the dog's current condition, of his fear, of the bond already formed. She did not have documents to match Mark's, only photographs from the night of the rescue and veterinary notes documenting hypothermia and stress. It wasn't much. Ethan could see the weight of inevitability settling over the room. As the judge called for a short recess, chairs scraped softly against the floor. People stood, murmuring. Mark checked his phone immediately, face expressionless. Emily remained seated, eyes closed, one hand pressed against Max's ribcage, counting his breaths. Sarah leaned close, whispering reassurance that sounded thin, even to her own ears. Ethan stayed where he was. He stared at the seal of the state mounted behind the judge's bench, its eagle frozen mid-spread, and felt an old, unwelcome clarity settle over him. The dog was special, not because of paperwork, not because of price, but because he carried something rare and fragile inside him, potential paired with damage. In the wrong hands, that combination could become dangerous. In the right hands, it could become extraordinary. Ethan knew that truth down to his bones. For the first time since leaving the teams, Ethan felt the faint stir of purpose cutting through his carefully constructed numbness. He didn't yet know what role he would play in what came next, or whether he would play any role at all. He only knew that the story unfolding in that gray courtroom was no longer something he could dismiss as someone else's problem. When the judge returned and the room settled once more, Ethan leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the puppy in Emily's arms, already understanding that this case was about far more than ownership. It was about whether a living being would be treated as an asset or given the chance to become what it was born to be. And that distinction, Ethan realized, was one he could no longer ignore. The judge reconvened the court just after noon, when the pale winter light pressed flat against the high windows and erased any sense of time passing. The murmur in the room faded as people settled back into their seats, coats folded over chairbacks, breath still faintly visible in the cold air that seeped through old walls. Ethan Walker remained in the last row, spine straight, hands relaxed but ready, his mind unusually clear. The recess had done nothing to dull his certainty. If anything, it had sharpened it. He knew now that this moment, this narrow window, would decide more than the fate of a single puppy. Sarah Milton rose from her seat before the judge could speak. Up close, the strain on her face was unmistakable. Her auburn hair, usually neat, had loosened slightly during the recess, strands escaping to brush her cheek. Her shoulders were squared, but there was tension there, a tightness that came from carrying responsibility without leverage. Sarah had built her career representing people with more heart than resources, and it had shaped her into someone stubbornly ethical, quietly relentless. She cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the stakes, and formally requested permission to call an independent witness. She did not oversell it. She didn't dramatize. She simply stated the credentials. Former Navy SEALK 9-handler, certified trainer, specialized in trauma recovery for working dogs. The judge studied her over steepled fingers. His gaze drifted briefly to Ethan, assessing him with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned to read people without trusting first impressions. Mark Reynolds' attorney objected immediately, rising with smooth urgency, arguing relevance, timing, procedure. Mark himself watched from his seat, expression calm but eyes alert, like a man tracking a variable he hadn't anticipated. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as the judge raised a hand for silence. After a brief pause, the judge allowed it. "A limited observation," he said. "No speeches, no demonstrations beyond what was necessary." The decision seemed to surprise Mark more than anyone else. Ethan felt it land like a quiet command. He stood, movements controlled, and walked down the aisle with the same measured pace he'd used on patrols years ago. Every eye followed him, but he didn't look at any of them. He stopped several feet from Emily's table and waited for instruction, hands clasped loosely in front of him. Up close, Emily looked smaller, thinner than she had from a distance. There was resolve in her posture, but fear lived just beneath it, fluttering like a trapped bird. She shifted slightly to give Ethan space, instinctively pulling Max closer to her chest. The puppy's reaction was immediate. His breathing quickened, his body stiffening as the unfamiliar man approached. His eyes locked onto Ethan, pupils dilated, assessing. Ethan recognized the response instantly. Fear, yes, but not blind panic. It was the fear of something unknown that might matter. The judge gave a short nod. Ethan lowered himself to one knee on the cold tile floor, the sound of fabric brushing stone echoing softly in the room. He did not speak. He did not reach out. He did not look directly at the dog. Instead, he turned his body slightly sideways, presenting less of a threat, and placed one hand flat on the ground between them, fingers relaxed, palm open. The gesture was deliberate, almost ritualistic, a posture designed to communicate calm without dominance. The room seemed to hold its breath. Mark leaned forward despite himself. Sarah clasped her hands together, nails biting into skin. Emily's arms tightened around Max as the puppy began to tremble, a low whine escaping his throat before he caught himself and fell silent again. Ethan remained motionless. He regulated his breathing, slow and even, the way he had taught countless dogs to mirror. He thought of nothing. He simply was. Seconds stretched, the kind of seconds that felt longer than minutes. Then Max shifted. It was a small movement at first, barely perceptible. A paw sliding against Emily's coat, a tentative lean forward. Emily froze, afraid to interfere. Max's ears twitched, one lifting higher than the other, and his nose lifted slightly, as if catching a scent that made sense to him. He sniffed once, twice, then pushed gently away from Emily's chest. A soft gasp rippled through the room as the puppy wriggled free, landing clumsily on the floor. His legs wobbled, uncertain, but he stayed upright. He took one hesitant step toward Ethan, then stopped, body taut, ready to retreat. Ethan did not move. He kept his gaze unfocused, fixed somewhere beyond the dog, signaling patience rather than expectation. Another step. Then another. The tremor in Max's body lessened, replaced by concentration. When he reached Ethan, he didn't touch the man's hand. Instead, he circled once, sniffing, then sat an awkward, imperfect sit, just close enough that his shoulder brushed Ethan's knee. The contact was accidental, tentative, but it happened, and Max did not pull away. The silence that followed was absolute. No one spoke. No one shifted. Even the heating system seemed to quiet, as if the building itself were listening. Ethan slowly turned his head, not toward the dog, but toward the judge. Only then did he speak, his voice low, controlled, carrying easily in the stillness. He did not declare conclusions. He described observations. The dog's approach without prompting, the absence of command cues, the reduction in stress behaviors once proximity was achieved. He explained what it meant, clinically, without embellishment. This was not obedience, he said. This was recognition of safety. Dogs bred for work, especially those with high drive, sought structure and calm. Trauma distorted that instinct, but did not erase it. When such a dog chose proximity voluntarily, it indicated an assessment, not submission. Ethan felt the weight of his own words, the echo of a life where trust had once been mutual and absolute. Mark's attorney rose again, objecting, attempting to reframe the interaction as coincidence, as sentimentality. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The judge listened, then asked Ethan a single question: whether such a response could be trained or staged. Ethan answered honestly. It could, with time and conditioning. But not here, not now, not from a dog this young and this guarded. Mark shifted in his seat, irritation bleeding through his composure. He spoke out of turn, insisting the dog's reaction proved nothing about ownership. The judge silenced him with a glance. Ownership, the judge reminded the room, was not the only matter under consideration. Welfare mattered. Potential harm mattered. Emily had begun to cry quietly, tears sliding down her cheeks without sound. She pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed not by victory, but by validation. For the first time since this ordeal began, someone had seen what she had felt, but could not prove. That Max was not just afraid, but waiting for something steady enough to anchor him. Ethan stood when instructed, rising smoothly, careful not to startle the dog. Max watched him closely, then, after a moment's hesitation, followed his movement with his eyes only, staying where he was. That choice, Ethan knew, mattered too. The dog trusted the situation now, not just the person. The judge called for the next phase of testimony, his expression thoughtful. The balance of the room had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Mark's paperwork still existed. It still carried weight. But it no longer stood alone, unchallenged by reality. As Ethan returned to his seat, he felt the familiar aftermath of engagement settle into his bones, a mix of clarity and cost. He had stepped back into a role he had sworn off, crossed a line he had spent years avoiding. But as he looked at Max sitting beside Emily's chair, posture uncertain yet calmer than before, Ethan knew he would not regret it. Some instincts, once awakened, refused to be silenced again. The courtroom resumed its rhythm, voices and movements returning gradually, but the moment lingered like a held note. The decision was not yet made, the outcome was not yet certain, but the truth had entered the room, quiet and undeniable, and it had chosen where to sit. The courtroom shifted after Ethan stepped down, not with noise but with a subtle reorientation of gravity, as if the air itself had accepted that something irreversible had just happened. The judge requested additional evidence, his tone calm but firm, and the bailiff moved with practiced efficiency toward the monitor mounted beside the bench. The room dimmed slightly as the screen came to life, the pale daylight from the windows now competing with grainy footage pulled from a security camera mounted high on the exterior of a residential garage. The video quality was poor, the colors washed out by snow glare and low light, but the shapes were unmistakable. Mark Reynolds's property appeared on screen, a wide driveway edged by bare trees, the garage door yawning open like a dark mouth. A timestamp blinked in the corner, marking a night weeks earlier, when temperatures had dropped well below freezing. The footage showed Mark himself, recognizable even in distortion by his height and posture, carrying a small, struggling shape toward the garage. The shape resolved into the puppy, legs dangling, body rigid with fear. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the footage continued. Mark placed the dog inside the garage, removed the blanket wrapped around him, and stepped back. The door came down with mechanical indifference, sealing the space. The video skipped ahead in time, minutes marked by sudden jumps. The door did not open again for hours. Emily's breath hitched, her face drained of color as she watched, one hand gripping the edge of the table as if to keep herself upright. She had known Mark could be careless, controlling, dismissive, but this was something else. This was calculated. Sarah Milton leaned closer to her client, her jaw set hard, freckles standing out starkly against pale skin. Sarah's eyes never left the screen, her expression sharpened by a quiet, burning anger that came from years of watching power excuse cruelty. Mark reacted differently. At first he scoffed, a short, disbelieving sound that echoed too loudly in the hushed room. His confidence cracked only briefly, replaced by irritation rather than shame. He straightened in his chair, smoothing his tie as if composure itself could undo what everyone was seeing. When the judge turned to him for explanation, Mark stood, shoulders squared, voice controlled. He described the incident as training. Exposure, he called it. Conditioning a working dog to tolerate harsh environments. His tone suggested reason, even expertise, as though suffering were merely a necessary inconvenience on the path to usefulness. He spoke of resilience, of preparing animals for demanding roles. He did not look at the puppy once. Ethan listened from the back, muscles tight, jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He recognized the language immediately. He had heard similar rationalizations in places far removed from Montana, justifying actions that stripped living beings of agency in the name of efficiency. He thought of the line between training and breaking, a line Mark had crossed without hesitation. The judge did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His disappointment filled the room, heavy and unmistakable. He asked a single question, one that landed with precision. Whether Mark had consulted any certified trainer or veterinarian before subjecting the dog to such conditions. Mark hesitated just long enough. The answer, when it came, was a defensive no. The judge nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He glanced toward Ethan, not seeking opinion this time, but confirmation that the implications were as serious as they appeared. Ethan met his gaze and gave a subtle nod. Trauma induced at such an early age could have permanent effects. Anyone with even cursory experience knew that. The proceedings moved quickly after that. The judge called for closing remarks, but the tone had shifted irreversibly. Mark's attorney spoke again, but his words lacked their earlier authority, circling defensively around legal definitions that no longer felt sufficient. Sarah spoke last, her voice steady but layered with emotion she did not attempt to hide. She spoke of responsibility, of the difference between ownership and stewardship, of how power without empathy became harm. When the judge finally spoke, the courtroom was silent enough to hear the faint hiss of snow against the windows. He delivered the verdict carefully, each word deliberate. Emily Carter was granted full legal custody of the dog. Mark Reynolds was prohibited from contact directly or indirectly. The court strongly recommended immediate psychological rehabilitation for the animal under the guidance of a certified canine trauma specialist. Emily sagged slightly at the table, relief crashing through her in waves too strong to contain. Tears slid freely now, unchecked, her shoulders trembling as she pressed her face briefly into her hands. Across the aisle, Mark's expression hardened into something cold and unfamiliar. He stared straight ahead, lips pressed thin, already retreating inward, already calculating losses rather than consequences. As the judge adjourned the session, the light outside had shifted. The sky beyond the courthouse windows darkened into deep blue-gray, and when people filtered out onto the steps, street lights flickered on one by one, casting yellow halos into the falling snow. The town felt hushed, insulated, as if winter itself were bearing witness. Emily stood on the steps for a moment, clutching Max close to her chest, his body warm and solid against her. The puppy no longer trembled. He watched the world with cautious curiosity, eyes tracking movement without panic. Ethan paused a few feet away, uncertain, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt now that the role of witness had ended. Emily approached him slowly. Up close, Ethan noticed the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, signs of worry and endurance rather than age. She looked smaller than he remembered, but stronger, her posture less guarded, now that the immediate threat had passed. She thanked him simply, her voice rough with emotion. There was no attempt at grand gratitude, no dramatic gesture, just sincerity. Ethan nodded, unsure what to say. Words felt inadequate. He glanced down at Max, who studied him intently, head tilted slightly. The dog did not approach this time. He stayed with Emily, choosing proximity that felt safe. Ethan respected that. Trust, he knew, was not a switch that flipped once and stayed on. It was a series of choices, made and remade. Emily hesitated, then asked him something that surprised him. Would he be willing, she said, to help, just at first? The court's recommendation was clear, but she didn't know where to begin. She had no illusions about doing this alone. Her question wasn't desperate. It was practical. She needed someone who understood what Max was and what he had endured. Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinctive pull back toward isolation. He thought of his cabin, of the quiet he had built around himself like a wall. He thought of the weight of responsibility, of how easily attachment turned into loss. For a moment he considered refusing. It would be simpler, safer. Then Max shifted slightly in Emily's arms, ears lifting as if catching something only he could hear. His gaze flicked back to Ethan, not pleading, not fearful, just present. The same recognition from the day before, quieter now, but no less real. Ethan exhaled slowly. He agreed, carefully, setting boundaries even as he crossed them. Short term, he said. Focused on stabilization, he did not promise miracles. Emily nodded, accepting the terms without argument. She seemed to understand that this was not a rescue fantasy, but a process. They parted soon after, each heading in different directions through the snow. Ethan stood for a moment longer, watching their figures recede, the streetlights throwing long shadows across the white ground. The cold seeped through his coat, sharp and grounding. As he turned toward his truck, Ethan realized something had shifted inside him. He had stepped back into a world he thought he had left behind, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel its weight again. And for the first time since the war, that weight did not feel entirely unbearable. The night closed in around the courthouse, snow continuing its quiet descent, and with it came the understanding that endings, even just ones, were rarely the end of anything at all. Spring did not arrive all at once in the mountains of Montana. It came cautiously, in narrow streams of meltwater slipping beneath snowbanks, in mornings where frost still clung to shadows, while sunlight lingered just a little longer on the pine-covered slopes. 3 months passed in this in-between season, and with them, something inside Ethan Walker began to thaw. The cabin no longer felt like a bunker. Its windows were open more often now, letting in air that smelled of damp earth and resin instead of cold iron and isolation. The silence inside had changed, too. It was no longer the heavy, defensive quiet Ethan had wrapped himself in after leaving the teams. Now it was punctuated by soft sounds, paws moving across wooden floors, the low huff of a dog settling down, the faint clatter of a food bowl nudged accidentally out of place. Max had changed, not in some miraculous overnight way, but steadily, honestly, the way healing actually worked. His coat had grown thicker and glossier, the black along his back catching the light like polished stone. He had grown taller, his limbs lengthening, his oversized paws finally beginning to match the rest of him. His ears, once constantly pinned back, now stood more often than not, swiveling with curiosity instead of fear. At around 6 months old, he still carried the awkwardness of youth, but the tension that had once lived permanently in his body had loosened. The biggest change was his eyes. They no longer scanned every room for exits. They no longer flinched at sudden movement or raised voices. Loud noises still startled him, but he recovered quickly now, looking to Ethan not for permission, but for reassurance. Trust had taken root. Not blind trust, but earned, resilient trust. Ethan never rushed him. Every interaction followed the same principles Ethan had lived by in uniform: clarity, consistency, respect. No shouting, no dominance games, no forced affection. He rebuilt structure the way he always had, with routines that were predictable and calm. Morning walks at the same hour. Training sessions kept short and purposeful. Play introduced carefully, always ending before Max became overwhelmed. Ethan watched the dog the way he once watched teammates reading posture, breathing, energy. Emily visited often during those months, sometimes staying for coffee, sometimes only long enough to check in. She looked different, too. The constant tightness in her shoulders had eased. Her face carried color again, her movements less guarded. She had cut her hair shorter, a practical choice that framed her face and hinted at a quiet reclaiming of control. She never interfered with Ethan's work. She simply observed, listened, learned. When Max ran to her, tail wagging freely now, she laughed without fear of losing him again. Sarah Milton stopped by once, just once, driving up in an old sedan dusted with mud instead of snow. She stood on the cabin porch in sensible boots and a light jacket, hands in her pockets, eyes taking everything in. She looked relieved, satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with legal victory. She had always cared less about winning than about outcomes that made sense. Seeing Max alive, stable, and choosing connection felt like closure. She shook Ethan's hand firmly, thanked him without ceremony, and left without lingering. By the end of the 3rd month, Ethan knew his part was nearly done. The dog was stable. Emily was capable. The recommendation had been fulfilled. On paper, there was no reason for Ethan to stay involved. That fact both relieved and unsettled him. The morning Ethan planned to leave town arrived clear and bright. The last of the snow had retreated into shaded corners, and the road leading away from the cabin was wet but passable, bordered by emerging grass and the first stubborn wildflowers. Ethan loaded his truck methodically, muscle memory guiding him through a routine he had repeated many times in other contexts. Gear secured, tools checked, nothing forgotten. Max watched from the porch. He did not pace. He did not whine. He simply observed, head tilted slightly, ears forward, eyes focused. When Ethan knelt in front of him, the dog stepped closer, sniffed his jacket, and pressed his forehead briefly against Ethan's chest. The contact was deliberate, grounding. Ethan rested a hand on Max's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur. He said goodbye quietly. No promises, no commands, just acknowledgement. He stood, turned, and took 3 steps toward the truck. Max did not follow immediately. Emily appeared at the edge of the clearing then, having driven up earlier than planned. She stopped when she saw the scene unfolding, understanding instinctively that this was a moment that didn't belong to words. She watched as Max looked from Ethan to her and back again, the decision forming not in panic, but in calm assessment. Then Max moved. He did not run to Emily. He did not hesitate. He walked steady, certain, until he stood at Ethan's side, body aligned with his leg. He sat there, close but not clinging, eyes lifted expectantly. Ethan froze. For a long moment, no one spoke. The mountain air seemed to hold still around them. Ethan felt something shift deep in his chest, something he had kept locked away for years. He looked down at the dog, searching for confusion, for dependency, for fear. He found none. What he saw was choice. Emily stepped forward slowly. Her eyes were wet, but her expression was calm. She understood immediately what this was and what it was not. This was not possession. This was not abandonment. This was a working animal recognizing a partner, a damaged soul recognizing another who understood its language. "I think," she said softly, voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "he's already decided." Ethan swallowed hard. He had lost a partner once before. He had sworn never to replace that bond, never to reopen the door to that kind of vulnerability. But this was not replacement. This was continuation. He looked at Emily. There was no resentment in her gaze, no fear, only gratitude and release. She nodded once, giving permission without condition. Ethan opened the truck door. Max waited until invited. When Ethan patted the seat, Max climbed in and settled, posture relaxed, eyes bright. Ethan closed the door and leaned briefly against the truck, breath unsteady, the weight of the choice finally landing. Before leaving, Ethan walked back to the cabin porch. He removed a weathered wooden sign that had once been nothing more than a nameplate and replaced it with a new one, freshly carved, the letters dark against pale wood. Walker K-9 Recovery, where wounded souls heal together. When Ethan drove away, Max watched the road ahead, ears catching every new sound, tail thumping softly against the seat. The snow was gone now, replaced by earth ready for growth. Behind them, a quiet chapter had closed. Ahead, something honest and hard-earned waited. Not a miracle, not a fantasy. A team. This story is not really about a courtroom or a puppy or even a former Navy SEAL. It is about choice. Max did not choose the loudest voice, the richest owner, or the person with the strongest legal claim. He chose calm over control, presence over power, safety over ownership. In everyday life, we face the same quiet decisions. We choose who we trust. We choose who we become when no one is watching. We choose whether pain hardens us or teaches us how to protect others who are still trembling. Ethan did not rescue Max by force. He did it by standing still long enough to be trusted. And Max did not heal because the world became gentle. He healed because someone finally understood his language. In a world that rewards noise, speed, and dominance, this story reminds us that the strongest bonds are built in silence, through patience, consistency, and respect. If you have ever felt broken, if you have ever been afraid to trust again, if you have ever chosen to stay kind instead of becoming cruel, then this story is for you.